a little bit, give a little bit of background about myself. I went to BYU as an undergrad. I studied Near Eastern Studies, which I don't think is a degree anymore. I think it's kind of changed its name into something else. That's actually relevant to my story that I'm going to share with you all. And then I ended up going to England and did a master's out there in Assyriology, and I wanted to teach ancient archaeology. That was what I wanted to do. And somewhere along the way, I realized that there was 4 jobs and 8 people smarter than me, and I wasn't going to get one of those jobs. And so I found myself at the University of Washington and supporting Language Learning Resource Center there with the Arabic program, and realized that education technology was something really fascinating, something I wanted to get into. So started looking at different PhD programs and ended up at the University of Georgia, which some of you have probably heard of since I was there with Peter Rich and Rick West and a bunch of other people. There was a steady stream for some reason of like BYU grads, like one after another. Each year there was at least one. They had a seat in the graduate program for BYU grads for some reason or other. No, it just kind of happened that way. And then right after that, I ended up heading out to Minnesota. Well, as part of my PhD program, it's worth noting, I wanted to marry that international education, international studies with learning design and technology, and got a Fulbright to study in Oman. And I was there for a year doing a design-based research dissertation where I was basically looking at computer-supported collaborative learning and how does a pedagogy that's designed for North America or Europe, what does it look like when you try and put it somewhere else? And how does culture and national policy and expectations blend together and create a model for adaptation? And while I was there, I ran into another BYU grad, a person named Shahram Paxima, who now works at the World Bank. He was finishing up his EDD at Harvard, and his wife was from Minnesota. And so he had finished his coursework and went to Minnesota. Really interesting story. I'm telling you all this for a reason. He was on a plane to go to a conference called the Comparative International Education Society, CIES. And he was going to go, but being Minneapolis, the plane was delayed because of weather, and he got put on another plane. And he sits down on the plane, and he's just next to this man. And the man says, "Oh, you're going to San Francisco or LA or somewhere in California. I can't remember where." And what are you doing there? He says, "Well, I'm going to this conference so that I can get a job." And the guy next to him says, "That's interesting. I'm going to this conference to hire someone." And so by the time that they landed the plane, he had hired him and had him working on this big project that he was working on in Oman that was funded by the State Department. That one was funded by the US State Department. And so Shahram was in my branch in Oman, and he said, "You really got to meet this guy named Greg Sales." And I was in the midst of writing my dissertation, and I wanted to be an academic, and it wasn't worth my time to think about going to Minnesota because it's the frozen north and no one would ever want to go there. I said, "But okay, I'll meet him." So he came into Oman, and I had a conversation with him. It went okay. And then he kept coming back to do this project, and he was working with the same people I was working with. And by one of the last times we talked, he's like, "You really should consider coming out to Minneapolis." And so while I was finishing up my dissertation, I was going through the struggle that probably many of you, especially the doctoral students, go through. Is like, what do I want to do with my degree? And I was applying all over, and I wasn't getting really great advice from people for out of academic jobs, non-academic jobs, because there just wasn't, people that I was taking seminars from, PhD seminars, great people, Tom Reeves, Michael Hanifin, some just really fabulous scholars, but they just didn't have a lot of experience outside of academia. And so I ended up taking a job with Greg. I went out and visited and fell in love with Minneapolis. It's like the best kept secret in America. If you don't know about it, it is an amazing place. And so Greg Sales was one of the professors in the education technology program from a long time ago, back when Oregon Trail and the MEC, Minnesota Education Computing Consortium, was doing a lot of research on that, and a bunch of things came out of that. And so he started doing some consulting with Newton's, what is it called? Newton's Apple. Do you remember that television show from the 80s? A bunch of other stuff that was going on, and realized that it was better than his tenure track job. So he left his tenure track position, or actually had tenure. He had tenure and he left that to start this job full time, and then was doing, getting grants from NSF and Department of Education called Small Business Innovation Research Grants. Usually they give you up to $1 million over 2-3 years to develop a product and try and sell it. And he'd gotten a whole bunch of these and was really successful at that. And then he started working with a guy named David Chapman at the university, who was doing a lot of stuff in the international development side of things. And he said, hey, we've got these big projects in Jordan and Malawi and the Pacific and a bunch of different projects. Can you be a subcontractor on our projects? And since we were a for-profit, we could subcontract them. So it was this really interesting place where we were 1 foot in the university and 1 foot out of the university. Really, really loved that job. 10 people or so. I was teaching at the University of Minnesota, as well as running around doing these grants, and got an opportunity to go out and help the Ministry of Education in Jordan to develop online learning courses. Or in Malawi, we were working across the whole country to develop a early grade reading curriculum. And these are both USAID funded projects, just a lot of interesting projects like that. Then it led to getting a job at Pearson, where I led the learning design team. So I'm going to share, I heard that some of you might not be able to see slides, but I'm going to put this in the chat and hopefully you can access it. I also asked Echo just like an hour ago if she would send it around. So you might get a copy of it in your email, but here's a deck that I'm seeing people pop in, so it looks like permissions are working. While I was at Pearson, there were a number of things that we were working on that was different than anything I had been taught all along the way. We were working at a massive scale at Pearson. So our job was to figure out, like, we were working in multifunctional software and curriculum development teams. So large teams with like 5 engineers, a project manager, 1 or 2 product managers, several UX designers and researchers, data scientists, learning designers. It was very cross-functional teams, and very agile development process, and got very involved in human-centered design while I was there. I actually ended up co-leading the UX design and research team, as well as the learning design team while I was there. And I'm going to tell a story, and this is no offense to University of Georgia or academic institutions in general, but it just shows some of the mismatch that I've seen throughout my career between what I learned as a graduate student and what I practiced in applied research. And I feel like I saw Rick come in. Rick, I believe, did you do the qualitative graduate research certificate while you were at UGA?
Absolutely. I was indoctrinated in the postmodern theory. Yes, I was.
Okay, great. So Rick was in this programs, as was I, where you could get the equivalent of, I tell people, it's like a minor for your PhD. You have to take like 6 classes. You have to do a dissertation that's qualitative research. It was a lot of work. And not once in that time do I ever remember hearing the word user experience research. And not once in all of that qualitative research did they say, you know, you can take these skills that we're teaching you and go get a job somewhere like Google and make 6 figures doing this stuff. And so it wasn't until I started working at Pearson, I was like, I know how to do all this stuff, how to interview people, how to observe, how to like do focus groups. Like I learned how to do all this stuff. Yeah, I need to learn how to journey map or how to do an empathy map or some of these things, but those are pretty easy to pick up. And so there are a lot of transferable skills, but that gap was missing. And so getting in and working at scale and learning how human-centered design process works was really, really fascinating. We were working with millions of titles and courses and tens of millions of assessment items. And the numbers of students and interactions that we were having was at such a large scale. You had to really think about how what you're doing is going to impact every textbook that Pearson writes or every online interaction. So it had me starting to think about the different research traditions. So the slide that I'm sharing with you came out of my work when I was there. It basically, if you don't see it, it's 4 overlapping circles. And one of them is basic research. This is where we're understanding the theory of learning. This is what we were taught really, really well in programs like the one you're in. The next is impact research and evaluation research. Again, lots of really great programs. BYU is an excellent one at that, in being able to understand how to do evaluation and impact research. What I learned, oh, great, thanks for sharing, whoever did that. What I learned also along the way was design research. And what does design research look like, and how to do this kind of research at scale? It was something that I was kind of taught in fits and starts, but not at a systematic whole level until I was working at doing this at scale. And then the other area was market research, and seeing where the reach of a product, the sustainability, who's going to buy it, what's the target market, how much are they going to pay for it, was extremely important to education products. And I've seen education products that emphasize one of these pillars, or maybe 2, sometimes 3. I rarely see one that does all 4. And so oftentimes, depending on where the person is that comes into the field, if they are a learning scientist, they will emphasize the basic research really well. If they're an evaluator or they're a policy maker, they'll oftentimes look at the impact research. So there's also another 5th dimension I added at some point in the way I'll show you in just a second, but that's the technology research and pushing the limits of the technology. So if you have a technologist leading the institution or the organization, oftentimes it's very tech heavy. If you have a teacher or a UX designer or a product manager who's very design focused and human-centered design focused, a lot of times that will drive the way you do things. Or if you're a business person who's like, hey, I see an opportunity for education, that will drive the product. And you can look across every education technology product and you can start to say, oh, yep, that one was founded by a business person. And that one was founded by a university researcher. And that one was founded by a teacher. And that one was founded by a technologist, because that's where they emphasize their evidence and that's where they emphasize their growth. But sometimes you'll get a technologist who doesn't understand market research. Or you'll, in the case of an academic professor, my case in University of Minnesota, we get all sorts of grants from Department of Education, from NSF, but we couldn't get people to buy our products. We couldn't get teachers to use them. And it was because we had no function for market research. We didn't really understand what the user needs were. We didn't understand who would pay for it. We didn't understand how it would scale. And so I've seen that play out time and time again. As we were working together to create a design-based research function, we wanted to also develop rapid cycle evaluation, and both qualitative and quantitative. We worked with, there was a person on my team, some of you may know, her name was Angela Payne, Barris, at one point Barris and then Payne. Unfortunately, she passed away a couple years ago, but she was deeply involved, I think, with a lot of people at BYU. She was living there in Provo, working for us at Pearson. And we would do some really interesting co-design sessions. We had these virtual student groups where we could throw out an idea and get like 50 students to respond to it within 24 hours. And within 48 hours, have a results to the product team so that we could say, well, how are students reacting to this? And our mantra throughout all of that was just quick. How do we get reactions very quickly from people? And that was a muscle that a lot of education technology institutions didn't have. They're like, yeah, we talk to teachers. We'll go and put on a big focus group, and then we'll get this stuff. And in 6 months, we'll have your results. And we're like, we need the results by the end of the week because we have a decision that we need to make. And I don't want to make that decision without at least talking to teachers and students. So through that process, I also got the chance to work a lot with different functions. We were working on a number of wise interventions, what Greg Walton calls wise interventions. These are little nudges with big impacts. So how can you set up the instructions of an assignment to embed mindset messaging? And so we were doing A/B tests around that. And we worked with a really strong AI and data science team to do education data mining and learning analytics. We looked at machine learning to drive pattern recognition across these extremely large spaces. We worked with a person here in Boulder named Peter Foltz, who's done a lot of work with NLP and written assessment auto-grading. We worked with IBM Watson on question answering agents. We worked on image recognition problems for math. We worked with a person named John Behrens, was on that team on intelligent tutoring systems and adaptive learning. So I got a really big exposure to a lot of the machine learning and AI focused stuff, but it was always someone else's project. I was coming in as a learning designer, kind of driving the functions of learning and what good learning is. And then someone else was turning that into a product. Then I had a chance to go to Abu Dhabi and lead an education team while I was there for a startup. I put that in air quotes because it was actually run by the royal family of Abu Dhabi, and they had unlimited resources. And so we were building a digital learning tool for K-12 in Arabic and English. It was an interesting time to be there. I thought that I would be able to drive some of the innovation agenda, and I thought that I'd be able to drive some of the learning sciences, but I learned pretty quickly when you work for the royal family, you do what they want you to do. And I also learned about how to build and design stuff extremely quickly. So we would take like 2 years to do something at Pearson. They would ask us to do it in 2 months. And so started to learn how to design and build design teams and the constraints of design, as well as local constraints. It was very, very interesting to think about some of the design considerations we had to make as we were creating these courses. For instance, here's a great example. We were not allowed to have any pictures in any of our online learning that went to students that showed a man and a woman together in the picture. And I challenge any one of you who's worked with stock footage or anywhere where you're trying to get images very quickly to find pictures of students in a classroom that don't have men and women together. It was extremely difficult. So oftentimes we'd have to crop them or we'd have to do something else. Other times we had to have any women in a picture had to have their sleeves to their wrist. And so again, I challenge you to find lots of pictures with people with sleeves to their wrist. And so we had to be really creative about how we approached local constraints, and working in a local environment was built off of the kind of stuff that I was doing in my dissertation. I was invited to come work for the Chan Zuckerberg Initiative, which is Mark Zuckerberg's philanthropy based in Redwood City, California. And I was invited by a person named Bror Saxberg to come there. He recognized the work I had done at Pearson, building up a learning design team and driving some of this understanding about the intersection of different research types. And he was really excited to build up a learning engineering team, and wanted me to come in, build the team internally, working with one of our major products is Summit Learning Platform, which is a K-12 project-based learning curriculum and platform used by a bunch of schools, private and public, throughout the United States, as well as all of our grantees. We had a number of grantees and our investment portfolio. So people like Newsela, ABC Mouse, Handshake, Trilogy. There was a number of different organizations that we were invested in. And my job was to come and help to drive the way they apply learning sciences and the way that they continuously improve learning. So this was kind of a challenge for me to jump from a learning design title to a learning engineer title. And I'll be completely honest, it took me a little while to reconcile that. I was a designer. I was not an engineer. And that was a big part of my identity. And so I had to reconcile what is the difference between a designer and an engineer when it comes to building and designing things. And so I spent a fair amount of time looking at that difference and investigating how it looks in other design sciences. And one of the definitions of an engineer was a person who looks at the entire system, including costs, implementation, manufacturing, like what does it take to manufacture that? Rather than just creating a prototype, you have to think about, well, how are we going to produce this at scale? And there's a really great book right here called Learning Engineering for Online Education that Bror co-edited with Chris Deedy at Harvard and John Richards. they give some really great oversight about the kinds of things that learning engineers do. So I highly recommend it. I also at this time was looking at like, how do Lego designers design their sets? It's really interesting because they'll have software. It's often software enabled. There's some sort of authoring environment that helps to calculate those constraints, the design constraints. So if you've never seen how a Lego system designer works, bear with me for just a second. They often are given, okay, it's going to be City Lego or Harry Potter Lego or whatever it is. And so the brand and the colors and a set of pieces that you can use is already predefined. Then they define, back to the market research question, they define how much they believe that this product can sell for. And so they think this is a $100 set or an $80 set or a $60 set. And that constraint is set up front. And so it's a $100 set. It's sold in this way. It needs to be, you know, $100 worth of value, but we're also going to set the margins. We expect if it's a $100 set that we're going to sell it for, or that it shouldn't cost us more than $20 to make, whatever the margin is for the business. And so as you go in, each piece that you add to your design is calculated by how much it will cost to manufacture that piece. Some pieces are really expensive to make because they're on a mold that you have to change out on the factory floor and you can only print so many at a time, and they're not used in a lot of sets. Others are used in a whole bunch of sets. They're pretty ubiquitous. They're very cheap. And so as a designer, you're putting these things together and creating your design. And then you go, oh, shoot, I'm 50 cents over. I got to take these two pieces back and put another piece. And then it puts the constraints into your design. And so when I think about learning engineering, some of it is that. Another thing that I was thinking about was how engineering isn't about doing something once and then it works. And how often do we approach our design, our curricular design, or our instructional design, that we're going to make something, we're going to create this lesson, and we're going to run it, or we're going to create this technology and we're going to do it and it works. And then we collect data and we say, yep, it worked or not. Usually we launch it and it doesn't work. And then we tweak and we modify and we change. And so if you look at the troubleshooting that engineers usually go through, you put it all together, the prototype, it doesn't work. So you take it apart, you put it all together, you prototype again, it doesn't work. You take it apart, you do it again and again and again. And then finally you calibrate it just right and it works. And so in learning, we often miss that continuous cycle of iteration, rapid cycle iterations, and continuous improvement. And so I spent a lot of time looking at that continuous improvement process and how do we collect data extremely early. And as the rigor of the, as the risk of the product increases, the rigor of the research increases. So sometimes it might be, I've got a wireframe. The risk of making a mistake in my hypothesis or my design is quite low, but I do want to get some input. So I'm going to talk to 5 students, or I'm going to talk to 5 instructors. It doesn't have to be a very large number. Don Norman did some research, and then there's some diminishing returns after about 5 people that you talk to on that sort of getting user feedback. And so then the next stage, I'm going to create a working prototype. I'm going to run it in a lab setting. I'm going to test that out with 25 people. Okay, great, that worked. Now I'm going to launch it into a cohort of 1,000 people. I'm going to collect some data on that. Now I'm ready to launch it to 1 million people and collect data and continuously improve on it. And then my methods, my research methods are going to get more and more rigorous as time go by. One of the things that I've seen with a lot of education technology companies, maybe they have a $50,000 technology that they built, or maybe 500,000. Let's say it's $500,000 to spend to build this technology. They're going to spend $50,000 on an RCT to test that thing. Those kind of economics don't work out very well, right? Unless you get some sort of grant from IES or something like that. And so most businesses will say, I'm not going to spend the money on that kind of evaluation. So what can I do where I can collect data for $5,000 or less? And so when you start to think about the economics of the research that you're doing and the value of the answers that you're getting, that to me is part of the learning engineering process. It also, learning engineering, as with any other engineering, requires a solid theory of action. I believe that by putting this intervention in this setting, I should get these behaviors. And I believe that if I see these behaviors, they should lead to this outcome. And some of you may know, oh my gosh, I'm totally blanking on the name. This is so embarrassing. UCL, William Sandoval. William Sandoval has a really great model called the Kirkpatrick is good, but it wasn't the one I was looking for. William Sandoval has a really great model called conjecture maps. Conjecture maps are designed into two different halves. There's the design conjecture and there's theoretical conjecture. So when you're building out your product, you say, what are the things, what are the inputs that I believe will lead to these actions? That's your design conjecture. And you can test that with all sorts of really great human-centered design. So you can say, I believe that if I do this lesson with this technology in this setting, and the student comes with this prerequisite background and the teacher comes with this prerequisite background, I should see this instructional action. And so you start testing that, and you test that until that happens and it's predictable. And then you move it to a different setting and to a different context. And once you start moving it to different contexts, you can start to look at the generalizable output of your design. Does doing that behavior lead to the outcome that I'm looking for? Increased learning of mastery of this concept, or increased self-efficacy, or increased persistence and graduation rates, or whatever the outcome is that matters to you. Breaking it down into those two parts is extremely helpful, because some people will jump directly to, I'm going to launch this out in the world and I'm going to test graduation rates. And they're like, didn't get it. And when they start to reverse engineer it, they realize, well, it's because the assumptions of what I thought would happen in the classroom never happened. And so then you say, well, why didn't that happen? And you start working on that problem until you you calibrate that and reiterate that until you're able to get, thank you, Heather, that was perfect. And so let me see, there's that context constrains the design. And what I realized working across a large number of organizations in lots of different countries and different settings is there is no one way of doing things. I know that sounds really simplistic, but it amazes me how often, if you go look at like the What Works Clearinghouse or the way that educators talk about education, they say, we need something that works. I want to know what works for education. And there is no magic thing that if you do this, you will get this outcome. It is all context specific. And there's pretty good reasons why. There's a really great quote I'm going to give you from a study that Renee Kizelchek and Justin Reich did on MOOCs. So MOOCs was a really great study. They had done some mindset interventions where they're like, consistently we're seeing that if we teach people about growth mindset, then they have greater persistence in the course. So we have these MOOCs that have millions of users. We're going to go launch this into this MOOC that's being used around the world, and we should see those outcomes, right? Well, the result was it didn't work out the way that they thought. And they said, in the quote, they said, if people wanted to say, quote, if we just had a large N, then we would prove X. That's something that people are constantly looking in the research. If I just had a bigger N, then I could prove X. In this study, they sent it out to 250,000 students. Sorry, it wasn't a million, it was 250,000. Still, that's a very large N. In 247 countries around the world. And they concluded that there are individual contextual and temporal conditions under which the intervention works. And so as learning engineers, we have to start to understand the context. We have to understand what makes this classroom different than that classroom. And why does it seem to work in this classroom and not that classroom? There's a couple of researchers at Indiana University, Ben Motes and Emily Fife, who've been working on a model called many classes. And the idea is that if I measure the impact of many different classrooms, then I can actually look at the variation of this impact and see where the impact happens. I don't know, but I have a guess that a large number of these no statistical significance studies that happen in education are because the results get washed out. It impacts one group of students. It doesn't impact another group of students. When you lump that all together in the aggregate, or it has harm on another group of students, you lump that together and then it doesn't have an impact on a large group of students. You put that all in the aggregate and you're going to get like a neutral finding. And so as we start to break apart the context, what is it that this teacher does? And why is that different than this? There's some things that you can learn on that. And then building off the work of Jeannie Century and at the University of Chicago has been doing on implementation research, which very much builds on this tradition of how do the different implementation variations actually lead to us understanding not what works, but what works for whom in what conditions. And that's what we're actually looking for, because that's an engineered approach to learning. So on that variability and learning variability, there's a lot of really interesting stuff that we did. We worked with a guy named Vic Vucek at Digital Promise. He's working on this thing called the Learning Variability Navigator. A person named Todd Rose, pretty popular Harvard professor, written a lot about like end of average and some other things about variability. There's some concepts that are coming out called the jagged profile or different things where like every learner has different assets and they have different strengths. And as we understand the variation in students and variability in students, we can better understand how our interventions work for which students in which conditions. So they created this learning variability navigator. It's really great for K-12 settings. They worked with a bunch of researchers to look at in what conditions does this intervention work? And so you can look and say, I want this goal in this intervention, and then it will give you some strategies like, hey, if you structure your class in this, or here's a strategy that seems to work. And so as we've continued to work in learning engineering, some of it is starting to define that, what interventions work for whom and what conditions, and trying to figure out which applications, how does this application embody that strategy. But it's extremely tricky because ultimately at the end of the day, all learning is driven by communities of practice. And I'm not going to spend a lot of time going on this, but if you want to go down an extremely deep rabbit hole that's extremely fulfilling, the work of Vygotsky's students, Leontiev and Luria and Rubinstein, on activity theory helps to give us a really clear idea of how communities of practice set goals for the people in that community. And there's this continuous feedback loop of building a model that will get you to that goal, externalizing that to some sort of action or word or picture or tool, enacting that in the world, collecting feedback on whether that helped you to get your goal, revising your internal model and doing that over and over and over again, layering on top of that social activity. And so that can drive our outcomes. The point I'm going to try and make here is Yrjö Engström wrote a really great paper about the future of activity theory. He's one of the people that brought activity theory to instructional design. He said that the fields like design-based research and other fields like that are a good step forward, but they presuppose that we know what the objective our students have is, that our objectives as researchers are the same objective or goal of the students, and it isn't often the same. In fact, a great quote on this, one of my colleagues here at General Assembly said, someone told him, education is full of a bunch of Hermiones who think that they're designing for other Hermiones when really they're designing for Ron Weasleys. And so as we build things, we think that our objectives are the same as the students, and it's not often the case. And that's why we consistently are like, man, why aren't they doing this? Why aren't they engaging with this? And so what activity theory says is, what if you ask the participants what their objectives are and let them drive that design? And so they propose some participatory design practices, collabs, and some of these other things that design studios that are definitely worth looking at as you start to figure out, how do I empower other people to tell me what they want to learn instead of me coming in and assuming that I'm going to measure you on these outcomes. And I just came from a really great meeting with a working learning session led by some people at Stanford and a bunch of others. We're looking at working learners. And one of the challenges in this field is that a lot of policymakers and educators are measuring things like graduation rates, time to graduation, number of credits accumulated, a number of these lifetime earnings. And 75% of Americans don't have college degrees. And so what is it that's meeting them and their needs? Maybe they're dropping out of college because they have to care for family, or because they ran out of money, or because they, whatever. There's all sorts of other things that are meeting their immediate needs that don't align with the needs of the learner, or with the organizations, the policy organizations. And so if you went to those learners and said, did dropping out of college meet your goals? They would say, yeah. It met my goal. And it actually opened up this opportunity that allowed me to go this, even though I didn't get a graduate, or didn't graduate, I didn't get a degree. I learned some skills that now got me this job. I'm moving, I'm progressing. My objective is not the same as your objective. And the way you're measuring that objective shows me as a failure when I, in fact, am a success case. And so getting better measures and aligning those, there's some really interesting things that are going on. So rapid cycle evaluation, collecting those measures, some of the really cool things that are happening with NLP. There is a guy named Scott Crossley. We were looking at this thing called the Feedback Prize. This is one of the things that we funded, where we were looking at ways of collecting better assessments that provide feedback using NLP. There's a really, really cool project that Zach Pardos at University of California, Berkeley did, where he took NLP processes that look at the structure of a sentence and how parts of a sentence connect with other parts of a sentence, and the strategic alignment of that over large data sets, right? If you were to take that and apply that model to sequences students take through their college courses, you can parse a sentence of, I took this class, then this class, then this class, like length over time, the same as you would parse a sentence in English from left to right. It's temporal movement across these connected ideas. And so he's using BERT and some of these transformer ideas from NLP, for those that you know, to be able to better understand connections between articulation, like between classes. So BERT, one of the classic examples, if you know much about transformers and NLP, basically says, if I can take king minus man plus woman, what does that word give you? And so it's structured language in a way so that it says, oh, king minus man plus woman equals queen. And so it takes the structure of a sentence and mathematically, or the structure of meaning of words, and mathematically represents them. So if I said, I take biology 101 plus honors minus biology plus chemistry equals chemistry, advanced chemistry 102, or whatever the course is. And so they could take these articulations and say, oh, you took this class over here in this department. It's actually the same. When we've looked at the sequence that students take through their journey, you can get there in the same pathway. So some interesting stuff going on there. I'm gonna skip ahead. There's some issues about what is good data policy. I heard a really interesting term yesterday about surveillance capitalism, right? We live in a world of surveillance capitalism where people are extracting from us our data by surveilling us and our interactions on the web. And so there's a lot of questions about data and data stewardship. Who owns that data? What does student consent look like? What assumptions are in training data that drives models? What objectives, assumptions, or biases are in the models? Are the models optimized to? Who benefits and who is harmed from those? And there's some really cool people who are driving some of this work. If you want, there's a really cool project called the AI in Education Toolkit that drives some really good ways to design and ask yourself some questions as you're building AI. Okay, I'm going to end with this, and then I want to spend some time for some questions. All of this has led me to start to understand more the nuances of data and the transactions it enables. So I think I called this course What I Wish I Had Learned as a Graduate Student and I Didn't. So I started by saying, I wish I had known that UX and qualitative research were actually the same skill set, but with a little bit of tweaking, I could get a job. I wish that I had learned Python and natural language processing and some basic machine learning models as a graduate student. As I've spent time, I've gotten deeper and deeper, and I've learned that I can actually learn this on my own. I spent a good part of the last couple of years just diving, and there's amazing resources available for free. There's also, a shameless plug for places like General Assembly, where you can build up your skills in these sorts of areas and add those to what you're doing to get highly marketable jobs in this space. And when I was talking with Scott Crossley, who's at Georgia Tech, and does a lot of natural language processing, he says there just aren't enough learning scientists doing natural language processing, right? The tools are there, the use cases are there, the research questions are there, but there just aren't enough of you and me who understand the basics of natural language processing to do the really interesting stuff. Another person said, when I was on a panel with some people from Duolingo and Khan Academy and a bunch of other like big ed tech platforms, they said we have a lot of really good product analytics. We can understand how long people are on here, how long they, how they come to us, how much they're spending. So we don't have very good learning analytics, and we're not instrumented really well to be able to collect that learning analytics. And this is true across a lot of learning products. And so more and more companies are starting to say, we need learning analysts who can come in and understand the data and understand these models and be able to drive an understanding of what learning looks like. In another learning engineering setting, one time someone mentioned, we don't just need computer scientists and data scientists and bring them in and have them run complex models on learning data. He said, we've been doing that and it's not working. He said, what we need is people who deeply understand the data. What does that data mean? What does it mean in a classroom? What are the assumptions behind it? How is it collected? What are its limitations? And that's usually comes from a learning scientist. And so in the realm of learning science, learning technology, learning engineering, learning design, this is the questions that we can ask and answer. And so if it's not us, who's going to answer these questions? I've also spent a lot of time in the last few years at CZI looking at social emotional learning factors of learning, how sense of belonging, sense of identity, the executive function, a number of what we would call non-academic measures or non-cognitive skills are actually at the heart of a lot of real learning and the confidence the students have to make mistakes and to take risks and to take feedback in and to action on it and a bunch of other things. So there's some really cool things that the Mindset Scholars Network is doing. Some researchers like Jason Akonafua at University of Berkeley, California, Berkeley, he was looking at how relationships form and how teachers, the words they use about students lead to discipline issues. So you have cases where teachers will call Black students troublemakers for the same activities that white students would do and not get in trouble. And as soon as they labeled them as troublemakers, those students had much higher referrals for discipline. They went in and they trained teachers and told them that they were doing that. The teachers went, oh my goodness, I had no idea. They stopped, reframed their understanding of students. Discipline went way down. Discipline issues went way down. The activities and the behaviors of the students were exactly the same. It was just the framing of the teachers, the framing of the students. Those things have really big impacts on learning. And the last thing I want to share is the work that we've been doing around, there's a lady named Say Schatz at the Advanced Distributive Learning, ADL. She works for the Department of Defense. The ADL is a subcontractor for the Department of Defense, have been driving stuff around XAPI, or what used to be called Tin Can, as a standard for getting experiences from multiple data points into a learner record store so you can track students across longitudinally as they're learning. Some really fascinating stuff. A really great book I recommend everyone reads called Modernizing Learning. It's an ebook. You can get it for free. Say Schatz, S-A-E-S-C-H-A-T-Z is one of the authors of that. And so all this led me to, if you want to pull up that slide again, whoever had it up before, some questions that I'm going to leave you as a gift, and then I will leave time for people to ask questions. I started to realize that maturity map actually, or those 4 Venn diagrams actually turned into more. So if you go to slide 2, there are these 7 pillars of research that happen in a product. There's the strategy, the market research, the who, what are our goals, our major learning objectives, what is our value proposition, what is the scope of this project, what are the general market trends, what is our brand strategy. Then there's this foundational learning science one. What are our strategic scope, within the strategic scope, what are the specific academic and non-academic learning objectives? What behaviors or activities will lead to those? And then we have this user need. What are the goals and intentions of our target audience? How does our target user persona currently act towards those goals? Different aspects of UX research. And then you have the build questions. Is this technically feasible? How do we implement this at scale? How do we do it within the proposed budget? Those all get you to a build. And I have them kind of coming to a point because they start really big, 60,000 foot view questions, and then they get more and more small until it's like, what things do we put in this screen on this moment and this interaction with this student, and what words and what interaction, like how do we code this? So you're moving from really big view of learning to a really micro view of learning. And then you expand back out with the research questions that you ask. So that's you're designing for impact. And then you want to determine your impact. So you start with usefulness. Did this lead to the behaviors that we expected? And that's your design conjecture side of thing. And then did this lead to the outcomes that we thought at a small scale as we continue to revise this with small numbers of users and pilots? And then did this lead to the large scale impact that we expected it to have? Did it predict, can we predict interventions that lead to these activities? So if you go to the next slide, there are a number of research methodologies or different skill sets that lead to these. I have never seen an organization that is at level 4 across all of these. I have seen organizations that are at level 4 on 1 or sometimes 2 of these, and they might be level 1 or level 2 on any of these. And so one of my jobs in learning engineering is to get organizations to move from a level 1 on each of these to a level 2. And if they're at a level 2 to a level 3, or to work with them to say, how strong do you need your foundational science? How strong do you need your formative impact? So a number of different kinds of methodologies that we use to get there. So all of this is to say, the things that I wish that I had learned as a graduate student is, one, I wish that I had known that there was an extremely robust and growing field of applied research. I'm constantly hiring learning scientists who don't just write academic papers or aren't just instructional designers, but are somewhere in the middle. And it's a rarity to find them, but they exist, right? And I've hired BYU grads. I've hired a lot of people from Carnegie Mellon, from Arizona State, from Stanford, from Harvard, from Columbia. Those are the sorts of places and the sorts of programs that really drive that kind of thinking. Secondly, I am consistently driving my teams and the people I hire to get better at human-centered design and qualitative research and user experience research and design, as well as quantitative, better understanding statistical models, machine learning, AI, Python, R, getting people to be able to analyze and drive all of their decisions based off of evidence, both quantitative and qualitative. And so those are the kinds of skills I wish that I had been trained in. And then the other thing that I'll tell you is you don't have to worry if you don't get them in grad school, because you can get them in your career. I did. I learned a lot of this stuff along the way. So continue to learn. I feel like I know learning better now than I did as a graduate student, because I have a much better sense of the kinds of questions that impact people every day and the kinds of things and evidence that help me to make decisions that will impact that design. And so if I were to go back and rewrite my dissertation today, I'd write it totally differently. I would report on my results totally differently. I would ask the question totally differently. I would design it totally differently. And so those are the things that hopefully will guide you as you're going in your path. And I will turn it to questions. I saw one come in on the channel. You see, I think it was Charles Graham asked, how did the organizations you work with use the big data that you're talking about and still address local needs where a group of learners might be different than others? That one is really great. That's where you get some of these models, like many classes, where you start to say, okay, we have big data and we're not looking at the aggregate. Like, did we lead to this? We really want to understand these factors. So building a model of a student where you say, and it doesn't have to be every data point, it's the data points that matter. And so it takes a lot of observation, a lot of like qualitative research to really understand, oh, it's the way that students interact with teachers at this moment that's really important. So we're going to collect data on that moment, and then we're going to put that as one of our weights or one of our features that we're looking for, and seeing, do those features actually contribute to the outcome that we're looking for? So there's a lot of things that we've kind of been doing to drive that. Do you have any other further questions, Charles, about that? You also asked, when thinking about design and learning engineering, what are humans really good at versus what are machines really good at? And how do we leverage the strengths of human actors and machines together? Oh, that's a really great question. I have spent the last like 20 years hearing people say, AI will replace teachers. And I don't think that's true. As with any technology, if you guys know the ideas of German philosopher, I'm totally blanking, the Vorhanden and Anhanden, like having a tool on hand and versus at hand, like when it becomes an extension of your body. When does a hammer become an extension of your body instead of it being this separate tool? And when we can get AI that helps people to make good decisions by looking at patterns, machine learning is great at recognizing patterns, at predicting things and classifying things. That's it. That's about all it's good for. But it's hard for us to do that across very large spaces. And so when we use that to help us to make decisions, but ultimately at the end of the day, human has to understand the ethics of it. What are the impacts of that decision? Who is it biasing? Who's being benefited from it and who isn't? Those are very human questions that AI is horrible at right now. Oh, one other book that I recommend highly everyone read, Justin Reich's book called Failure to Disrupt. It basically goes over like the last 20 years of my career and the projects that I've been working on, and asking questions about why they don't succeed. Why is failure, or why is disruption so hard with ed tech? And then they look at things that are really well designed, like Scratch, and why don't those scale in the classrooms? And they say, is there a place that is in the middle? And they look at some really good models like Desmos, which is like probably my favorite ed tech for a lot of reasons.
All right, Dave, we are going to, we're out of time here, so we are going to pause. Thank you so much for your contribution, your thoughts, and your enthusiasm about these topics. Let's just give Dave our usual round of applause here. Students will be back again next week for another seminar, and we'll just go ahead and conclude at this point. Again, Dave, thank you so much for being with us today.
Thank you for inviting me.